One of the questions I get asked all the time is whether everybody with Hashimoto's needs to be gluten free. The honest answer is that the evidence isn't nearly as strong as perhaps social media might have you believe. Now, before anybody gets upset, there are, of course, some people who feel better without gluten, and that's a very different thing to do you need to be didactically gluten free. As it happens, I feel a little bit better not having too much gluten, but I certainly don't stop myself from having gluten. My son, who has Hashimoto's, he can't eat gluten. It makes him feel awful. He's not celiac, but he just doesn't suit it. So it isn't about not being anti gluten or pro gluten or anything else. It's again about individuality. So there are patients who feel that their bloating's better, their digestion's better, their energy improves, and they genuinely feel better. That's fine. But that is very different to saying every single patient with Hashimoto should avoid gluten for life. The strongest evidence that we have about gluten is obviously celiac disease. And we know that there is a higher risk of celiac disease in patients with Hashimoto's. And that's because autoimmune conditions cluster together. Nothing more, nothing less. And it doesn't mean that Hashimoto's has caused you celiac or vice versa. It's just that somebody who has one autoimmune disease might well have another. So it's always worth testing for celiac if you have Hashimoto's. Now, the irony of that is that if you then go gluten free because you think you might have celiac, then you can't then test for celiac because you need to have eaten gluten for at least 6 to 8 weeks before you have the test. But if you do find that you have celiac, you need to be very strictly gluten free, like really strictly gluten free. Um, it's essential, otherwise, you won't absorb your nutrients, you won't absorb your medications, you have a higher risk of all sorts of gut issues. But outside of celiac disease, the evidence for gluten free is very much less. Now, I've got a little thing by the side of me to remind me of the names of all of these studies. So, one of the most commonly quoted studies is a small pilot study by someone called Krysiak and colleagues, published in 2019. They followed 34 women with Hashimoto's and found that those following a gluten free diet for 6 months had reductions in thyroid antibodies levels compared to those who continued their normal diet. Now, you look at that and it sounds very impressive, right? But the problem is it was small, it wasn't randomized, and it didn't show dramatic improvement in symptoms. It just showed slightly lower level antibodies. Now, that doesn't actually mean you're going to feel better, doesn't mean that you're necessarily slowing down your progression of Hashimoto's. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. And that was only over 6 months and wasn't significant and wasn't a proper randomized study. Since then, other studies have looked at the same question. 2023 meta-analysis, which is where they bring lots and lots of small studies together and analyze the results, all of them together. They reviewed the available evidence, found modest improvements in thyroid antibody levels, and perhaps some thyroid hormone parameters. However, again, the authors concluded there is insufficient evidence to recommend a gluten-free diet to all Hashimoto's patients who do not have celiac disease. So, in other words, the evidence is interesting, but it's not definitive. It may be beneficial to some people. Well, that you can say that about everything in medicine, quite frankly, and that's always the way that I practice medicine. It's with nuance. It's not you must do this, you must do that. It's try it. It might work for you for 6 months. If it doesn't, brilliant. I did it for 6 months. I did it for 9 months, actually, being gluten free. My antibodies went up by the end of it. So I would have completely skewed all of their results. So, why am I telling you all of this? Partly because I have so many patients who come to me who've been gluten free, dairy free for 20 years and they're like fed up. They're not living a life. They haven't had bread and cheese, which is quite frankly one of the world's most nice food that there is. They haven't had that for 20 years and they're still going, but I still feel awful. That's because it's not the right thing. Generally, underneath most of the thyroid problems is a thyroid hormone problem, not your diet, not your lifestyle. Again, going back to root cause analysis, not because you've caused it, because actually what you need is proper thyroid hormone replacement. And how you get that is based on you. And we will work together with that. If you come to me and tell me you feel better being gluten free, brilliant. I'm not going to stop you. I'm not going to tell you you must eat gluten, but equally, I'm not going to tell you that you mustn't. So, as always in medicine, it's about balance, biology, evidence, individuals. No one approach for everybody.